Hello everyone, Dr. Mad here. Let's get mad about English literature. So, this lesson is about assessment objectives and marking criteria. So, this is absolutely critical if you want to do well. You need to know where you're going, how your answers are going to be marked if you're going to do well. So, this is called exam technique. Okay, it's really, really important. So, the assessment objectives are AO1, read, understand, and respond to texts. Students should be able to maintain a critical style and develop an informed personal response. Use textual references, including quotations, to support and illustrate interpretations. Okay, so obviously you need to read something first, right? That's obvious. You need to understand it. But then, actually, in English, that's not enough. You need to respond to it. And in English, that normally means to write an essay. Okay? So that's what we're talking about when we talk about responding to text. So the word text is a generic word which could mean a novel, a play, a poem, a short story. Yeah. So the word text is a generic word to describe all these different types of things that you can read and respond to. Now, critical style is important. So, critical doesn't mean being negative about something. When we talk about in everyday life, we talk about criticizing someone, we normally mean it in a negative way. But in English literature, that's not what we mean. Here, critical means to analyze deeply and objectively. Okay? Another word for that is a better word for that is critique. All right. Critique does not have negative connotations. Critical can have negative connotations if you don't know what it means. So in this context, it means to critique, to have a formal, academic, objective style. Develop an informed personal response. So obviously, when you write your essay, you give your response. That's going to be personal, isn't it? So this word informed is important. What it means is it's not just your opinion. All right. It's not just some opinion that somebody on the bus could give. It's an opinion that you have formed by reading widely, by considering all different kinds of view before you come up with your own personal opinion. Okay. It's a balanced opinion. So textual references is a generic word to show that it's not just about quotations. So quotations are where you pick out words and phrases from the text, you put them into speech marks, and those are called quotations. But some you don't always have to do that. You can use what we call references, where you just kind of reference like a pointing. You point to a place in the text, all right, and it doesn't have to be exact. So therefore, it's not an exact quotation; it's a reference. And this is important because sometimes students say, "Oh, why do we have to memorize all these quotations?" Well, the answer is you don't. You do have to memorize some. It's a good idea to memorize some, but you don't have to memorize hundreds of quotations. To support and illustrate interpretations, well, uh, so that's really obvious. That's kind of tying in with everything that I've said about this personal response and so on. So that's worth 40%. 302, analyze the language, form, and structure used by a writer to create meanings and effects using relevant subject terminology where appropriate. So the word analyze is important. It means to examine deeply. Okay. So that's what you're doing. So you read, you understand, and then when you respond, you have to analyze. All right. It's beyond the surface. It's not basic. You need to go deep. Language means words and phrases. All right, in simple terms, it means words and phrases. You're going to pick out words and phrases. So, linking back to this idea of quotations here, form means type or genre. So, are we talking about a play, a novel, or a poem? And depending on what you're talking about, it will define how you respond. Okay. Now, the word structure is important. Students often think it means the layout. That's not really true. Okay. That's only about 10% of structure. When it comes to poetry, yes, it can be the layout, but structure really means the beginning, middle, and end of a text. How is the content organized? So if you think about a novel, for example, to talk about the layout of a novel doesn't make any sense. You could talk about the chapters, for example, all right? That would be structure, how it's organized, but layout wouldn't make any sense. So structure means how does the writer begin? How do they develop their theme, their ideas, their message, and how do they end? To create meanings and effects. Well, the word meaning should be obvious and clear. Effects is a bit more tricky. Effects means thoughts and feelings. Okay. When we read, when we experience the world, we have effects on us. Okay. We have thoughts and feelings. Well, strangely enough, when we read something, the same thing happens. We get effects, which is quite remarkable if you think about it, that these kind of marks on a page can create thoughts and feelings in us, but that's what happens. So effects means thoughts and feelings or images that come to your mind using relevant subject terminology where appropriate. So this is important, relevant and where appropriate. So if you just throw around terminology for the sake of it, you're not going to get that many marks, okay? You have to use it where it's relevant, where it adds value, all right? So terminology means things like techniques, for example, similes and metaphors. But techniques can also mean word classes, nouns and verbs and adjectives. And like I say, not just throwing them about, but using them appropriately. So that's also 40%. AO3, show understanding of the relationships between texts and the context in which they were written. So that's a long roundabout way of basically saying context, okay? So the context of a text is everything that's not in the text itself. So it's everything surrounding the text. It's the writer, it's the society in which they lived and wrote their text. Be careful, you're not going to get many marks if you give that if you say things like, "Oh, this writer was born at this time and they died at this time, or they got married at this age," and that you won't get any marks for that. Okay, you only get marks for things which are relevant to the text. How the facts of their life that affected their writing. Okay, so be very careful about that. Now, so these two here, AO1 and AO2 is 40% each. Context is 15%. Now, what's really important here is that on the one hand, 15% is quite a lot. All right, so you really can't afford to miss out 15%. It's 1.5 grades. The good news is that that doesn't mean that your essay has to be 15% context to get 15% of the marks. Actually, you only need a little bit of context. But if you can make that context really count, be really relevant, then you can actually get those 15% marks quite easily by just being very careful about the context that you discuss. And then AO4, use a range of vocabulary and sentence structures for clarity, purpose, and effect with accurate spelling and punctuation. So that's a long roundabout way of saying basically grammar and punch and vocabulary. Okay. So try and use a range of vocabulary, but be careful. Don't throw in fancy words for the sake of it. Okay. Again, it really needs to be relevant. Sentence structures, so using long and short sentences, and spelling, punctuation, and grammar. Okay, so basically, this is grammar and punctuation and vocabulary. Now, it says 5%. The way it works in literature is that you only You get marks for certain questions. So the important thing here is that on the one hand, you might think it's only 5%, but on the other hand, grammar does affect the way you write and the meaning of your writing, okay, the clarity of your writing. So in that sense, you really, I would say, you need to be using good grammar all the time, okay? You mustn't think, oh, this question's got 4 marks for grammar and therefore I'm going to be careful, and this question hasn't and therefore I'm not. It doesn't work like that. So if I were you, I would really, in a way, ignore this in the sense that not that it's not important, but actually you need to be doing this all the time, okay? And in fact, the other thing to say is that it talks about 40%, 40%, 15%, and 5%. Actually, when the examiners mark, they are told to mark what we call holistically. They look at the overall essay, all right, and they kind of balance it all out. So these are not really mathematical numbers. The examiners don't literally give it like this, but this is more of a guide, all right. That obviously AO1 and AO2 are the most important, right? That should be the most of your essay. Context is very, very important as well. It's 15%. It's 1.5 grades. And then this 5%, on the one hand, you might think it's not important, but actually I would say you should be writing with the best grammar all the time and vocabulary because it affects everything. Okay. And grammar is not something that you can really switch off and on. Ah, now these objectives are quite long, okay, and these are really more for teachers rather than students. So I normally simplify them to what I call the simplified objectives. So AO1, read, understand, and respond to text using quotes and references. So remember, response basically means an essay. Quotes are where you pick out words and phrases exactly and you put them into speech marks. And references is where you're kind of pointing to a place in the text where it doesn't have to be exact. AO2, analyze language, form, and structure using relevant subject terminology where appropriate. Okay, so remember, language means words and phrases, form means type or genre. Is it a poem? Is it a play? Is it a novel? And then you can have subtypes. So, for example, if it's a poem, is it a sonnet? Is it a dramatic monologue? Structure means beginning, middle, and end. It does not mean the layout, although in poetry, for example, layout can be part of it, and only using terminology where appropriate, not throwing it around for the sake of it. Context means everything that's not inside the text itself. So it could be about the writer, it could be about the society. But remember, with the writer, it's not about just biographical information for the sake of it. You will only get marks if it's uh, something that affects their writing. Okay. Now, moving on to the marking criteria. So these are the criteria that examiners actually use when marking your work. Um, Now, these grades are approximate because it kind of depends on the year, on the grade boundaries. If students do really well, the grade boundaries go up, as you probably know. If they don't do so well, it goes down. But roughly speaking, this is correct. So let's start with level one. Simple, explicit comments. So that should be fairly self-explanatory, but you don't want that because all you're going to get is a grade 1 or 2. So this means 1 or 2, not half. Supported relevant comments. Now here you're getting there, especially at the top end. If you get a grade 3, now grade 3 is not a bad grade actually. It means that you are almost there. You're almost on the passing grade, but you just need to do a bit more. Now, supported relevant comments. What does that mean? So supported means that you're giving the evidence. So this links back to the AOs. So you're giving quotes basically or references. Relevant means you're answering the question. If you go in and write down some random essay that you've memorized, even if it's a grade 9, if it's not relevant to the question, you're not going to get any marks. Explained and structured. Now this is interesting because so explain hopefully is self-explanatory. I'm sure you know what that means, hopefully. Now, structured, linking back to what I said earlier, that structured means beginning, middle, and end, not the layout, right? You can see here clearly structure can't mean layout because what on earth would that mean? So, what this means is that your answers flow nicely from beginning, middle to end. They are logical and clear all the way through. And if you can do that, and at the top end, you are getting to that magic grade 4. So remember, we need to get to that grade 4 as a bare minimum. All right. Grade 4 is the minimum passing grade. But what we really want to aim for is this level 4 here, clear understanding, where you can then start to get like a really decent grade. So 5, 6. So 5 is a solid passing grade, and grade 6 is very good. It's the old grade B. So here, clear understanding. Now, what that means is two things. It means that you understand the text clearly and the question clearly. Also, that you have been able to put that into your essay so that the examiner, when they read your essay, the essay is clear. All right. So there's two levels of clarity here, that your understanding is clear and that the way you write it in your essay is clear to the examiner. Obviously, hopefully you can see that the two things are related, right? I mean, you have to be clear in your mind in order to be able to be clear in your writing. But actually, sometimes students are clear in their mind, but they're not able to write it down. And you often hear students saying, "Oh, I know what I'm trying to say. I understand it, but I can't explain it." Well, you need to be able to explain it in writing. Okay, so that's clear understanding. And then to get to the really high grades, 6, 7, 8, 9. So thoughtful, developed consideration. Well, hopefully the word thoughtful is self-explanatory, although it's interesting actually because thoughtful means, in a way, it relates to the whole point of literature. Students sometimes say, "What's the point of English? What's the point of literature?" Well, literature and English, it's not really about grammar and so on, okay? It's about human nature. It's about understanding people, but also about making you, as a student of literature, into a thoughtful person, all right? And when you become thoughtful, that shows up in your writing. And then this word develop means where you're able to extend your analysis. You can write not just one or two sentences, but you can write three or four sentences or a whole paragraph on one point. Okay. So that's what we mean by developed. And then to get to these grade 8, 9s, obviously, that's at the top level. So convincing, critical analysis, and exploration. So it's really just kind of like the next level up. So convincing means that when the examiner reads your work, they are convinced by your argument. Now, they may still not agree with you, right? You don't need to worry about that. You don't need to worry about whether the examiner will agree with you or not, but they are convinced that the points you are making are backed up by the evidence you've given, all right? It's like when you're having an argument with somebody and you say to them, "You know what? I see what you're saying. I totally get it. You've explained it. You've given all the evidence. I don't quite agree with you still, but I get it, right?" So that's what you want the examiner to be thinking when they read your essay. So critical is just, remember what I mentioned earlier. It's about being objective, not just your personal opinion, but really showing that you've thought about it, you've talked to different people, talked to different teachers, read lots of different writers before you've come to your decision. And this word exploration is just like the next level of developed. So level 8, no, this is really just the same as level 3, level 5, but at an even more deeper level. Okay. Now, that's the generic AOs and marking criteria. There are a few specific things you need to be careful of in terms of the papers and the individual questions. Okay, so this is the last slide. So the literature paper is composed of two papers, paper one and paper two. So paper one is Shakespeare. For example, you might be doing Macbeth or Romeo and Juliet. Um, there are some other plays, but these are the two main ones. And you are given one question and you are given an extract, and it's 30 marks. plus 4 marks for grammar for the AO4, remember? So 34 marks altogether. Now, the important thing is that you must not only talk about the extract that you're given, but the whole play as well. That's critical. If you don't talk about the whole play, you will be capped at a level 2. In other words, a grade like 2 or 3. You cannot get a passing grade if you don't talk. So if you look here, the maximum you can get is a grade 3, which is a complete waste of time because if you analyze the extract really well, right, even if your extract analysis is a level 6, if you don't talk about the whole play, you are capped at level 2. Okay, so you must talk about the whole play. Now, that's good and bad news, right? So it's kind of bad news that if you don't do it, you won't go above a level 2. But the good news is that even when you talk about the rest of the play, even if that's not perfect, even if that's not brilliant, right, you will still at least get the marks for your points on the extract. All right, and of course, hopefully the points on the whole play. Anyway, the point is you must talk about the whole play. Similarly, for question 2, the 19th century novel, so for example, Jekyll and Hyde, or A Sign of Fall, or Christmas Carol, it's one question. You are given an extract, and this time it's only 30 marks, no marks for grammar. But remember what I said, you can't switch grammar off and on. And it affects AO1 and AO2 as well. So just use good grammar and vocabulary all the time, okay? And again, if you don't talk about the whole novel, you cannot go above a level 2. You must talk about the whole novel. So this paper is 1 hour 45 minutes, which works out to about roughly 50 minutes per question, plus 5 minutes for kind of reading through the whole paper and deciding, and just kind of reading through the whole thing. So paper 2 is question 1, modern text, and inspector calls, for example, or there are other options, but most people do inspector calls. Now, there's good and bad news here. You get 2 questions, that's good news, and you can choose one of them. You only do one question. There's no extract. It's 30 plus 4 marks, similar to this, and I've talked about that, right? So I guess the good news here is that actually, so on the one hand, it's bad news that there's no extract. On the other hand, the good news is that you're bound to talk about the whole play. It's very unlikely that you will only talk about one bit of the play, okay? So you don't need to worry about this thing about talking about the whole play here or the whole novel here. So just remember, you only have to do one question, and it's normally a theme question or a character question. Students seem to find the character questions easier. Teachers, I find the theme question easier because actually it means that I can talk about all the characters. And actually, even if you choose the character question, then you can still talk about other characters as long as you link it back to the character in the question. Okay? And then poetry anthology, you are given one poem, you must compare with another poem. It's 30 marks. So again, you must compare with the second poem. So please, even if you can't remember the quotes from the second poem, you really can't remember much about the second poem, try, okay? Make an effort. Refer to the second poem as much as you possibly can so that at least you will get the marks for the poem that you're writing about that is given to you, okay? Otherwise, you will not go above level 2. Now, unseen poetry is kind of totally different, okay? So you have to be careful here. So there's part A, one poem given. Now, you must analyze that poem. No need to compare. Well, obviously, there's nothing to compare with, all right? So that's 24 marks. So that's fairly straightforward, actually. With unseen poetry, there's good and bad news. So the bad news is that you've never seen these poems before, so that makes it quite difficult. But the good news is that the poems tend to be a little bit easier, okay? And part B, you're given a second poem, and this time you have to compare back to this first poem here. And the other thing to notice here is you only get marks for methods. So you have to talk about techniques and terminology. Now, technically here, you don't need to talk about techniques and terminology. I mean, if we go back to AO2, It says here using relevant subject terminology where appropriate. Well, I mean, so similar to what I said about these extracts and referring to the whole play or the whole or the second poem. I mean, oh, sorry. Looking back to what I said about grammar, that you can't really switch grammar off and on. So similarly, you can't really switch methods off and on. Okay, so you really should be talking about techniques and terminology here and methods, right? That's just another word for methods. Um, so just technically speaking, you only get marks for methods here. But what I'm trying to say is you should be talking about methods all the time. You should be talking about techniques and terminology all the times, but obviously mostly about these AO1 and AO2 here. Okay, read, understand, and respond using language, form, and structure. Uh, Now, in terms of timing, paper two is 2.25 hours. Sorry, I've forgotten to put the timing here, but it's roughly 45 minutes per question. Okay. And in the case of unseen poetry, it would be 30 minutes for part A and about 10, 15 minutes for part B. Don't worry too much about part B. Okay. Students often write the same amount for part A and part B, which is ridiculous. This is 24 marks. This is 8 marks. It's not the end of the world, even if you don't do part B. So, whatever you do, do not waste half your time writing the same amount for part B as part A. Here, you can literally write three quick bullet points. They don't even have to be full sentences, actually, and you'd probably get at least half the marks. So, that's uh, about the exam, assessment objectives, and marking criteria. It's really important that you understand these things because otherwise, all your hard work in the exam would be wasted if you haven't really thought about how these exams are marked, what kind of things the examiners are looking for, what the assessment objectives are. So sometimes, you get two students who are both equally intelligent. One person knows about the AOs, knows how the marking criteria work. They work smart, not just hard. And you have another student who's equally clever. They don't think about these things, and they kind of end up with a grade 4 or 5 or even less than that, and the other person ends up with a grade 6, 7, 8, or even 9. So it's really, really important to work smart as well as hard to know what you're working towards. So hopefully that's been really useful, and that's all about the exam, the assessment objectives, and the marking criteria. One final thing to say, um, I've got here AQA, and most of these videos are based on the AQA. But remember that the actual main skills, the assessment objectives, and so on, these are actually from the Department of Education, from the government. So pretty much 95% of everything in these videos applies to all the exam boards. It just makes it a bit easier to talk uh, about specific exam boards, in this case AQA, which is what most people do. But if you are doing OCR or any other board, 95% of everything in these videos still applies to you.